reasonably, yes. I think FP2, certainly on my side, went a lot smoother than FP1, and I think there's just so many things to get to grips with. It's very different to what we had last year, but no, I think FP2 as a session was pretty smooth. Was able to build some consistency and start learning properly, which was good. Try and see what we've learned today, because I think everyone's going to find a big step overnight. I think we need to try and do the same.
March 6th, 2026. The first real day of the new Formula One era in Melbourne. Brand new regulations. Completely new power units. Teams still trying to understand their own cars. And then something happened that almost nobody predicted. Oscar Piastri crossed the line at Albert Park. And suddenly the timing screen showed a number that shocked the entire paddock. 1 minute 19.729 seconds. Faster than Mercedes. Faster than Ferrari. And more than half a second faster than Max Verstappen. At his home Grand Prix. On the very first Friday of the season. But here is the part that makes this story even more interesting. Most people only saw the lap time. Engineers saw something completely different. Because hidden inside that lap was a clue about how McLaren might be managing energy and traction better than several of their biggest rivals. A tiny detail. Easy to miss. But in the middle of a brand new regulation era, details like that can change the entire championship. So the real question after March 6th in Melbourne is not just how fast Oscar Piastri was. The real question is this. Did we just witness the first warning that McLaren could become one of the most dangerous teams of the 2026 season? Because if that lap was not a coincidence, then the fight for this championship might already look very different than anyone expected. And if you enjoy deep Formula One stories that reveal what most fans never notice, subscribe to the channel. Because this season has only just begun. And the real story is just starting. March 6th in Melbourne did not start with headlines for McLaren. In fact, the first hours of the weekend seemed to confirm what many analysts expected before the season began. Ferrari looked sharp immediately. Charles Leclerc set the early pace in the first practice session. Lewis Hamilton was right behind him. The red cars looked confident, balanced, almost comfortable with the new generation of power units and energy systems. For a moment, it felt like Ferrari might control the narrative of the opening day. And that would not have surprised anyone. Pre-season testing already hinted that Ferrari had a very competitive package for the new 2026 regulations. Meanwhile, other teams looked uncertain. Drivers were braking earlier than usual. Cars were sliding slightly on corner exit. And some power units behaved strangely as teams experimented with completely new energy deployment systems. Oscar Piastri had actually warned about this before the weekend even started. He said the first races of the new era could feel chaotic. Different teams using different philosophies of energy management. Cars behaving unpredictably in certain parts of the lap. And almost immediately, his predictions started to come true. Just a few laps into the first practice session, Piastri reported a very strange problem over the radio. He pressed the throttle, and the car simply did not respond. No real acceleration. Almost no power delivery. For a driver beginning the most important home weekend of his career, that is not the message you want to send to your engineers. For a few moments, the situation looked serious. Yellow flags appeared briefly while the team tried to understand what had happened. But the issue turned out to be something extremely revealing about these new cars. Not a broken engine. Not a catastrophic failure. A software problem. More specifically, a mapping issue affecting how electrical energy and combustion power were being delivered together. And in 2026 Formula One, that difference is enormous. These power units depend on an incredibly precise balance between mechanical power and electrical deployment. If the mapping is slightly wrong, the car can feel almost powerless even though the engine itself is working perfectly. McLaren quickly recalibrated the system. Engineers adjusted the energy settings. Within minutes, the car returned to normal behavior. And from that point forward, Piastri began quietly building something extremely valuable. Data. While other teams were struggling with strange behavior from their cars, the McLaren started running clean laps around Albert Park. Not chasing headlines. Not chasing the fastest time. Just learning. Learning how the tires reacted to the new energy deployment. Learning how the car behaved through the fast corners of Melbourne. Learning where the electrical power could be used most efficiently. Inside the McLaren garage, that information was far more valuable than a single fast lap. Because the real moment they were preparing for had not arrived yet. That moment would come later in the afternoon, when the second practice session began. And when teams would finally start removing the limits. Fuel loads dropping. soft tires appearing, drivers pushing close to qualifying pace. That is when the true potential of every car on the grid starts to reveal itself. And when that moment arrived in Melbourne, Oscar Piastri was ready. The second practice session in Melbourne began quietly. At first, nothing looked extraordinary. Cars returned to the circuit one by one. Engineers watched their data screens. Drivers slowly pushed a little harder with every lap. This is usually the moment when teams begin revealing their real pace. Fuel loads drop. Tires get softer. Energy deployment becomes more aggressive. And suddenly the lap times start falling. Mercedes looked strong almost immediately. Andrea Kimi Antonelli briefly placed the silver car near the top of the timing screens. George Russell followed closely behind. The Mercedes looked balanced, predictable, fast through the flowing corners of Albert Park. Ferrari was right there as well. Charles Leclerc continued the form he had already shown earlier in the day. Lewis Hamilton looked comfortable too. For different drivers. 3 different teams. All within a very small window of lap time. At that moment, the session looked exactly like many people predicted before the weekend began. A tight battle between Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull. And somewhere just behind them, McLaren. Oscar Piastri started the session on the harder tire compound. That detail matters. Hard tires rarely produce impressive lap times. Teams use them to understand balance, to evaluate tire degradation, to gather information about race pace. Because of that choice, Piastri's early laps looked completely ordinary on the timing screen. Several tenths away from the fastest drivers. Nothing that suggested what was about to happen. But inside the McLaren garage, the engineers were preparing for something different. They were waiting for the right moment to switch the program. Fresh soft tires, lower fuel, maximum energy deployment. The kind of run that simulates a qualifying lap. This is the moment on Friday when every team finally removes the limits. Drivers push harder. Cars reveal their true performance. And suddenly the gaps between teams become very clear. When McLaren sent Piastri back onto the track with the soft tires, the change was immediate. The car looked sharper. Through the first sequence of corners, the McLaren rotated beautifully. No hesitation. No sudden corrections. The car looked stable, almost planted to the asphalt. Then came the fast middle sector of Albert Park. A part of the track where many cars were struggling with rear stability. But the McLaren looked incredibly calm. The rear of the car stayed perfectly under control. The steering inputs were smooth. Piastri could push harder on corner exit without fighting the car. That is where lap time lives in modern Formula 1. And suddenly the timing screens began turning purple. Sector 1. Fastest of anyone. Inside several garages along the pit lane, engineers leaned closer to their monitors. Because when someone sets the fastest first sector of the session, people pay attention. Then Sector 2 appeared. Another purple sector. Now the entire paddock was watching. Because when 2 purple sectors appear back to back, everyone knows a serious lap is coming. Piastri exited the final corner. The McLaren accelerated smoothly down the main straight. And as he crossed the finish line, the number appeared on the timing screen. 1 minute, 19 seconds, 729 thousandths. The fastest lap of the entire day. And suddenly the atmosphere around the circuit changed. Mercedes tried to respond. Russell pushed harder on his next attempt. Antonelli tried another qualifying simulation. Close. Very close. But not enough. Ferrari also attempted another run. Still not enough. The lap remained untouched. And just like that, on the very first real competitive session of the 2026 season, Oscar Piastri was sitting at the very top of the timing screens in Melbourne. In front of his home crowd. But inside the paddock, something even more interesting started happening. Because engineers were no longer just looking at the lap time. They were studying the lap itself. And the more they looked at it, the more one detail started to stand out. The McLaren was not just fast. It looked incredibly stable. And in a season where most teams are still struggling to control these brand new cars, that single detail might be far more important than the lap time itself. Especially when one of the drivers watching that onboard footage was Max Verstappen. And his afternoon in Melbourne had been very different. While Oscar Piastri was celebrating the fastest lap of the day, another story was unfolding in a different garage. A story that almost nobody noticed at first. Max Verstappen's Friday in Melbourne did not go according to plan. From the moment the second practice session began, something already felt wrong. The Red Bull left the garage, rolled down the pit lane, and then stopped. Right at the exit. For more than 20 minutes, the car simply sat there while engineers worked through a technical issue. 20 minutes might not sound dramatic to casual fans. But during the first race weekend of a completely new Formula One regulation era, 20 minutes is an eternity. Every lap matters. Every data point matters. Teams are still discovering how these new power units behave, how the electrical deployment interacts with the tires, how the aerodynamics react when the energy systems push harder. And while other teams were collecting valuable information, Red Bull was losing time. By the time Verstappen finally returned to the track, the session was already entering its most important phase. Qualifying simulations. Soft tires. Lower fuel. Drivers pushing to the limit. Verstappen tried to recover quickly, but the rhythm was not there. Through several corners, the Red Bull looked nervous. Small steering corrections. The rear stepping slightly out of line. And then came the moment that defined his session. Pushing through one of the fastest sections of Albert Park, Verstappen attacked the corner aggressively. The rear of the car snapped sideways. For a brief moment the Red Bull was almost completely out of control. Verstappen fought the steering wheel, trying to save the slide. But the car ran wide onto the grass, then straight into the gravel. Dust exploded behind the car as it bounced through the runoff area. Pieces of debris flew off the floor of the car. It was not a heavy crash, but it was messy. Very messy. And messy sessions create a serious problem for engineers. Incomplete information. Eventually Verstappen managed to set a representative lap. 1 minute 20.366 seconds. More than 6/10 slower than Piastri's McLaren. Now in Formula One, a gap like that immediately catches attention. But experienced teams know something important about Fridays. They rarely tell the full story. Fuel loads are different. Engine modes are hidden. Teams are running completely different programs. However, something else happened inside the Red Bull garage after that session ended. Something much more interesting. Instead of focusing only on their own problems, the engineers started looking carefully at the onboard footage from Piastri's fastest lap. And that is when one small detail began to stand out. The McLaren looked incredibly calm. Through Albert Park's rapid direction changes, the car stayed stable. No sudden slides. No aggressive corrections. Just smooth steering and clean acceleration. That kind of balance is extremely difficult to achieve with the new 2026 cars, because these machines rely heavily on electrical energy deployment. If power arrives too aggressively on corner exit, the rear tires lose grip instantly. If the system holds back too much energy, the car becomes slow down the straight. Most teams are still trying to find the perfect balance between those two extremes. But during that lap in Melbourne, McLaren looked like they might already be very close to solving that puzzle. And that is exactly why engineers across the paddock started watching that lap again and again. Because if the McLaren really understands how to control energy and traction better than the others this early in the season, then the fastest lap on March 6th might not just be a nice headline for the home crowd. It might be the first real signal that the 2026 championship fight could be far more complicated than anyone expected.